on it, her long skirts dragging. She leaned heavily on her companion. He was not much taller than she, but he moved with a man's strength, supporting her swaying form. As the coach approached, without slackening speed or changing direction, he pulled her out of its path, and the carriage lamps illumined his face. It would have been hard to tell his age. Snow blurred the pale features that were twisted into a demonic grimace. His eyes met those of the staring occupant of the coach. Then he pursed his lips and spat. "Wait!" The boy put his head out the window, blinking snowflakes off his lashes. "Confound it, Thomas, stop! You come back!" The vehicle lurched, throwing him to the floor. Raging, he scrambled up and thumped on the closed aperture. Either Thomas did not hear him, or more likely, he ignored the shouted orders. A few minutes later, the vehicle stopped in front of the house. He jumped out and ran up the steps, breathless with anger and haste. The door was locked. He had to swing the heavy knocker several times before it opened. The butler's face was unfamiliar, so she'd got rid of poor old William, too. He'd been with the family for 50 years. The entrance hall was semicircular, in the classical style. Marble columns and marble floor, shell-shaped niches in the curved walls. While his father lived, the alabaster urns in the niches had been filled with holly and pine branches at this season. Now they were empty, the pure white of walls and floor unrelieved. In the door to the drawing-room, his mother stood waiting. She wore her widow's weeds well. Black suited her fair hair and ice-blue eyes. The soft, lightless fabric fell in graceful folds to her feet. Unmoving, her hands clasped at her waist, she looked at him with unconcealed distaste. "Take off your wet things at once," she said sharply. "You are covered with snow. How did you get—" For once he dared interrupt. "Tell Thomas he must follow my orders. He refused to stop and let me speak with them. A woman and a boy with her." His breath caught. The change in her expression was slight, but like all young hunted animals, he had learned to recognize the movements of the enemy. "But you know, don't you? They were here. You saw them." She inclined her head. "And you sent them away on such a night? She was very frail, ill perhaps." She always had a tendency toward consumption. He stared at her. "Do you know her?" "She was my dearest friend, close as a sister, until she became your father's mistress." The words were as brutal and calculated as a blow. The color drained from the boy's face. "I would have spared you that shame," she went on, watching him. "Shame?" He found his voice. "You speak to me of shame? After driving her away into the storm? She must have been desperate, or she would not have come to you." "Yes." A thin smile curved her lips. "He had been sending them money. It stopped when he died, of course. I don't know where he got it." "Nor do I." He tried to emulate her calm, but could not. He was only 14, and their temperaments were as different as ice and fire. "You kept a close hand on the purse strings." "He squandered my dowry within a year. The rest, thanks to my father's foresight, was mine." He ran to the door, flung it open, and rushed out. The butler, who'd been watching, coughed. "Your ladyship wishes—" "Send 2 of the footmen after him. They are to take him to his room and lock him in, and bring the key to me." Chapter 1. I found it lying on the floor of the corridor that led to our sleeping chambers. I was standing there, holding it between my fingertips, when Ramses came out of his room. When he saw what I had in my hand, his heavy, dark eyebrows lifted, but he waited for me to speak first. "Another white feather," I said. "Yours, I presume?" "Yes, thank you." He plucked it from my fingers. "It must have fallen from my pocket when I took out my handkerchief. I will put it with the others." Except for his impeccably accented English and a certain indefinable air about his bearing — I always say no one slouches quite as elegantly as an Englishman — an observer might have taken my son for one of the Egyptians among whom he has spent most of his life. He had the same wavy black hair and thick lashes, the same bronzed skin. In other ways he bore a strong resemblance to his father, who had emerged from our room in time to hear the foregoing exchange. Like Ramses, he had changed to his working costume of wrinkled flannels and collarless shirt, and as they stood side by side, they looked more like elder and younger brother than father and son. Emerson's tall, broad-shouldered frame was as trim as that of Ramses, and the streak of white hair at each temple emphasized the gleam of his raven locks. At the moment, the resemblance between them was obscured by the difference in their expressions. Emerson's sapphire-blue orbs blazed. His son's black eyes were half-veiled by lowered lids. Emerson's brows were drawn together. Ramsay's were raised. Ramsay's lips were tightly compressed, while Emerson's had drawn back to display his large, square teeth. "Curse it!" he shouted. "Who had the confounded audacity to accuse you of cowardice? I hope you punched him on the jaw." "I could hardly have done that, since the kind donor was a lady," Ramses replied, tucking the white feather carefully into his shirt pocket. "Who?" I demanded. "What does it matter? It isn't the first I've received, nor will it be the last." Since the outbreak of war in August, a good many fowl had been denuded of their plumage by patriotic ladies who presented these symbols of cowardice to young men not in uniform. Patriotism is not a quality I despise, but in my humble opinion, it is despicable to shame someone into facing dangers from which one is exempt by reason of gender, age, or physical disability. 2 of my nephews and the sons of many of our friends were on their way to France. I would not have held them back, but neither would I have had it on my conscience that I had urged them to go. I'd not been obliged to face that painful choice with my son. We had sailed for Egypt in October. Since my dear Emerson, the greatest Egyptologist of this or any other age, would not have allowed anyone, much less the Kaiser, to interfere with his annual excavations. It was not a retreat from peril. In fact, we might soon be in greater danger than those who remained in England. That the Ottoman Empire would eventually enter the war on the side of Germany and Austro-Hungary, no one of intelligence doubted. For years the Kaiser had courted the Sultan, lending him vast amounts of money and building railroads and bridges through Syria and Palestine. Even the German-financed archeological expeditions in the area were believed to have an ulterior motive. Archaeology offers excellent cover for spying and subversion, and moralists were fond of pointing out that the flag of Imperial Germany flew over the site of Megiddo, the biblical Armageddon. Turkey's entry into the war came on November 5th, and it was followed by the formal annexation of Egypt by Britain. The veiled protectorate had become a protectorate in reality. The Turks controlled Palestine, and between Palestine and Egypt lay the Sinai and the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to the east. The capture of the canal would deal Britain a mortal blow. An invasion of Egypt would surely follow, for the Ottoman Empire had never forgiven or forgotten the loss of its former province. And to the west of Egypt, the warlike Senussi tribesmen, armed and trained by Turkey, presented a growing threat to British-occupied Egypt. By December, Cairo was under martial law. The press censored, public assemblages of Egyptians forbidden, the Khedive deposed in favor of his more compliant uncle, the nascent nationalist movement suppressed, and its leaders sent into exile or prison. These regrettable